The year was 1939, a world still healing from the scars of the Great War, yet beneath the surface, another storm was gathering. Across Europe, nations were rebuilding, economies were trembling, and ideologies were clashing. While many hoped for peace, one man in Germany had a different vision fueled by revenge, expansion, and absolute power. His name was Adolf Hitler. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was drowning in poverty and shame. But Hitler, through fiery speeches and ruthless propaganda, promised to restore the nation's pride. He spoke of unity, strength, and destiny, and the German people listened. Slowly, democracy fell silent, and dictatorship took its place. Flags bearing the swastika filled the streets, and a new Germany was born under fear and fanaticism. In the East, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union watched cautiously. In the West, Britain and France hesitated, still haunted by the bloodshed of World War I. And while the world debated, Hitler acted. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what he called the Anschluss. Europe barely reacted. A year later, he demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. The world once again looked away, believing this would satisfy him. But appeasement only fed the monster's hunger. By September 1939, Hitler set his sights on Poland. He staged false attacks on German border stations using his own soldiers disguised as Polish troops to justify invasion. Then, on the dawn of September 1st, German tanks thundered across the Polish frontier. Within hours, the sky was filled with the roar of the Luftwaffe, bombers raining destruction upon Warsaw. It was the beginning of World War II. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their promises to defend Poland. But Poland stood alone, brave, yet surrounded on both sides. Because just weeks later, Stalin's Red Army invaded from the east, fulfilling a secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a shocking alliance between two ideological enemies, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. In less than a month, Poland fell. Its people suffered under brutal occupation divided between Hitler and Stalin. The world stood in horror as Europe plunged once again into darkness. But this was only the beginning. The countdown to chaos had begun. The drums of war echoed across the continent, and soon, no nation would remain untouched. Europe held its breath. The invasion of Poland had proven one terrifying truth. Germany's army was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't just strong, it was fast. A new kind of warfare had been unleashed. Blitzkrieg, meaning war. It was a brutal combination of speed, surprise, and destruction. First came the Luftwaffe, dropping bombs on key targets: railways, airfields, cities. Then came the panzers, roaring across the plains, crushing resistance before it could organize. And finally, the infantry, following close behind to secure what remained. It was chaos in motion, a storm of steel and fire. The world watched in disbelief. Poland had fallen in weeks. Britain and France, though officially at war, remained hesitant. No battles raged on the Western Front, only silence. This eerie calm would later be called the Phony War. But behind that quiet, Hitler was already planning his next move. In the spring of 1940, his attention turned west. Denmark fell in just a few hours. Norway, invaded soon after, succumbed in mere weeks. German paratroopers dropped from the skies, while the Kriegsmarine stormed the fjords. The Allies were too slow and too divided. Then, on May 10, 1940, the storm truly began. Germany launched its massive assault on France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Millions of civilians fled their homes as the thunder of war swept across Europe. German tanks sliced through the Ardennes forest, a route the Allies thought was impossible to cross. Within days, German forces encircled the British and French armies near Dunkirk. The world's greatest powers cornered and broken. Yet, in that moment of despair, something remarkable happened. As German bombers closed in, a desperate evacuation began. From May 26 to June 4, a fleet of over 800 boats, warships, fishing boats, even small civilian vessels, crossed the English Channel to rescue trapped soldiers. It was called Operation Dynamo. Under constant bombardment, more than 330,000 Allied troops escaped. They left behind their weapons, their tanks, their pride, but not their will to fight. Britain stood battered, yet unbroken. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared in his legendary speech, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." By June 22, 1940, France had fallen. Hitler stood triumphantly in Paris, gazing upon the Eiffel Tower as his armies marched through the city. Europe was under his control, or so he believed. But across the Channel, Britain prepared for the fight of its life. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and for the first time, the Nazi war machine would be stopped. The countdown to chaos continued, and the skies above Europe were about to burn. Summer 1940. Europe had fallen. France lay silent under German occupation, and across the English Channel, one small island stood alone against Hitler's Empire Britain. Defeat seemed inevitable. Germany had conquered almost all of Western Europe in less than a year, but to complete his domination, Hitler needed to do the impossible: invade Britain. Operation Sea Lion, he called it. Yet before his soldiers could land, he needed to destroy the one thing standing in his way: the Royal Air Force. And so began the Battle of Britain. The first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The skies turned into battlegrounds. German Messerschmitts and Heinkels faced British Spitfires and Hurricanes in deadly dogfights high above the countryside. Every day, the people below watched in fear and awe as the future of their nation was decided in the clouds. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted airfields and radar stations, hoping to crush the RAF's defenses. But the British, guided by their advanced radar technology, always seemed to know when the Germans were coming. Pilots scrambled in seconds, meeting enemy bombers head-on with unshakable courage. Then, on August 24, 1940, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on London. In retaliation, Britain bombed Berlin. Hitler, furious, ordered massive raids on British cities, the beginning of the Blitz. Night after night, German bombers filled the skies. Sirens screamed as explosions ripped through London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless towns. Families huddled in underground shelters, clutching one another as buildings crumbled above them. The glow of fires lit the night. The sky itself seemed to burn. And yet, Britain did not break. The RAF fought back relentlessly. Men as young as 18 climbed into their planes each dawn, knowing that many would never return. But, as Churchill said in one of his most powerful speeches, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. By October 1940, the tide had turned. The Luftwaffe was exhausted, losing hundreds of planes and pilots. Hitler postponed his invasion indefinitely. For the first time in the war, Nazi Germany had been stopped. The victory came at a terrible cost. Cities lay in ruins. Thousands were dead, and millions homeless. But Britain had survived, and in surviving, had given hope to the world. The sky that once rained fire now carried a message. Hitler could be resisted. The countdown to chaos would continue, but the flames of defiance had been lit. The year was 1941. Hitler stood at the height of his power. Western Europe had fallen. Britain was standing alone, and the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. But deep within, the Führer's mind burned an obsession, a hatred for the Soviet Union and its communist ideology. Despite the non-aggression pact signed with Joseph Stalin, Hitler believed that conquering the East would secure Germany's destiny. He called it Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. On the morning of June 20, 1941, without warning, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Alongside them thundered 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. It was a surprise attack of unimaginable scale. German propaganda declared it a crusade against communism, but in truth, it was a war of annihilation. The skies above the Eastern Front darkened with planes. Columns of tanks rolled endlessly across the plains of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. Soviet defenses crumbled in the first weeks. Entire Red Army divisions were encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were captured. Thousands of towns burned. By July, German troops had advanced hundreds of miles. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell one after another. Hitler boasted that the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months. But he underestimated one thing: the sheer resilience of the Russian people. In the depths of destruction, the Soviets began to fight back. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and moved east. Beyond the reach of German bombers, civilians dug trenches, built barricades, and joined militias. And Stalin, once silent and shaken, now rallied his people with chilling determination. Not one step back. As summer faded, the German advance slowed. Their supply lines stretched thin, their soldiers exhausted, and the Soviet resistance grew fiercer. Then came the Russian winter, the worst in decades. Temperatures plunged below 40 C. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. German troops, still wearing light uniforms, began to die not from bullets, but from the cold. The Battle of Moscow turned into a frozen nightmare. Soviet reinforcements arrived, fresh divisions from Siberia, trained to fight in the snow. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack. German soldiers, for the first time, were forced to retreat. Hitler's dream of crushing the Soviet Union in a few months had shattered, but he refused to admit defeat. The war in the East would now become a battle of attrition, a brutal struggle for survival that would claim tens of millions of lives. The Eastern Front had opened, and it would become the bloodiest battlefield in human history. The countdown to chaos had reached its inferno. While Europe burned, the Pacific simmered with its own tensions. Japan, once isolated, had transformed into an industrial and military giant, driven by ambition and desperation for resources. The Empire of Japan sought dominance across Asia and the Pacific. By 1941, Japan had invaded China, seized territories in Southeast Asia, and was eyeing the vast colonies of European powers weakened by war. But one nation stood in its way: the United States of America. The U.S. had imposed crippling oil and trade embargoes on Japan, hoping to curb its aggression. But instead of stopping the Japanese war machine, it pushed them toward a dangerous decision: to strike first, and strike hard. In secrecy, Japan prepared an audacious plan: a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Their goal: cripple the U.S. Navy before it could respond. The date chosen would go down in history: December 7, 1941. At dawn, the sky above Hawaii filled with the drone of approaching aircraft. Without warning, waves of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes descended upon the harbor. In moments, explosions tore through the calm morning. Battleships erupted in flames. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. A massive blast split the ship in two, killing over 1,000 sailors instantly. Smoke choked the air as sailors leaped into burning waters, desperately trying to save their comrades. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds below deck. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. 188 aircraft were lost, and over 2,400 Americans lay dead. The nation was in shock. A peaceful Sunday morning had turned into hell. That same evening, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American people with words that would echo through generations. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. In an instant, the conflict that had engulfed Europe became a global war. Factories roared to life across America. Men enlisted by the millions. Women filled factories, building the weapons of victory. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, a sleeping giant had awakened, and it would not rest until the Axis powers were crushed. For Japan, it seemed like a glorious victory, but it was only the beginning of their downfall. The Pacific Ocean, once a path to conquest, would soon become a graveyard. The world had changed forever. The countdown to chaos now spanned every corner of the earth. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of peace. Japan's strike wasn't just an act of war, it was the beginning of a brutal campaign across the Pacific. As smoke still rose from Hawaii, Japanese forces unleashed a wave of invasions that stunned the world. Within days, they struck the Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma all at once. No empire in history had moved with such speed. Their soldiers, driven by loyalty to the emperor and the code of Bushido, fought with terrifying discipline and ferocity. In December 1941, Japanese troops invaded Malaya, sweeping through dense jungles and capturing Singapore, Britain's greatest fortress in Asia, in just weeks. It was a humiliating defeat for the Allies. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur fought desperately against overwhelming odds, but after months of resistance, disease, and starvation, they were forced to surrender in April 1942. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in the Pacific War. The Bataan Death March. 75,000 prisoners of war were forced to march more than 60 miles through scorching heat. With little food or water, thousands died along the way, beaten, bayoneted, or left to collapse by the roadside. The world looked on in horror as Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere revealed its true face, one of domination and cruelty. In the skies and seas, the Imperial Navy seemed unstoppable. Their aircraft carriers struck deep across the Pacific. Their battleships ruled the ocean, and their soldiers conquered island after island. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of New Guinea, the rising sun cast its shadow far and wide. But Japan had made a fatal mistake. It had awakened the might of the United States. Factories in America were now running day and night. Planes, ships, and tanks rolled off assembly lines at a pace never before seen in history. Every bullet, every bomb, every engine carried the echo of Pearl Harbor. By early 1942, the tide began to shift. In April, American bombers led by Lt. Col. James Doolittle launched a daring raid on Tokyo, a symbolic strike that told Japan, "You are not untouchable." The victory was small, but the message was enormous. The United States was coming, and it would not stop until Japan was defeated. The Pacific had awakened. The rising sun burned bright, but soon, it would begin to fade. The countdown to chaos was now racing toward the first great turning point of the war. By the summer of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at its peak. From the shores of India to the islands of the Pacific, their flag of the rising sun flew high. But while Japan celebrated its victories, the United States was quietly preparing a deadly counterstrike, one that would change the course of the war. The target was small and remote, a cluster of islands in the central Pacific, known as Midway. To the Japanese, it was the perfect trap. Lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into battle, crush them, and destroy the U.S. Navy once and for all. But what they didn't know was that the trap was already turned against them. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in secret, had cracked Japan's naval codes. They knew the date, the target, even the attack plan. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz positioned his carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in ambush. On June 4, 1942, Japan launched its assault on Midway. Bombs rained down on the island, setting fires and destroying runways. But as their planes returned to refuel, American dive bombers struck from the skies. In just 5 minutes of fury, history was rewritten. From above the clouds, the dauntless dive bombers plummeted toward the Japanese fleet. Their bombs found their mark, first the Akagi, then the Kaga, and the S-Rai. Each hit ignited massive explosions. Flames roared, ammunition cooked off, and thousands of sailors perished. By the end of the day, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were sinking, burning husks swallowed by the Pacific. The next day, the Hiri, Japan's last surviving carrier, was also destroyed. 4 Japanese carriers gone, hundreds of planes lost, and with them, the core of Japan's naval power. The victory at Midway stunned the world. It was more than a battle. It was a turning point. America had avenged Pearl Harbor, and the momentum of the Pacific War shifted forever. But the triumph came at a cost. The USS Yorktown was lost. and hundreds of brave American sailors and pilots never returned home. Still, their sacrifice had saved countless lives and changed the fate of nations. From that moment on, the Allies began to push forward. Island by island, step by step, they would reclaim the Pacific from the rising sun. The tide had turned, and though the war was far from over, the world now knew Japan could be beaten. The countdown to chaos was entering its next phase, and the balance of power was about to change across the globe. While the Pacific roared with fire, another fierce battle raged, far to the west across the scorching sands of North Africa. Here, under the blistering sun and endless dunes, tanks clashed like iron beasts in what became known as the Desert War. At the heart of it all was one-man Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. A brilliant tactician, Rommel turned the barren wastelands of Africa into his battlefield playground. His army, the Afrika Korps, struck with lightning precision, outmaneuvering the British at every turn. The year was 1941. After Italy's disastrous attempt to invade Egypt, Hitler sent Rommel to save the situation. And within weeks, he did more than that. He drove the British 8th Army hundreds of miles back toward Egypt. His bold attacks, rapid movement, and use of deception made him a legend even among his enemies. To Rommel, the desert was alive, shifting, deceptive, and unforgiving. He learned to use its vastness to his advantage, striking unexpectedly, disappearing before the Allies could respond. But despite his brilliance, Rommel's supply lines were stretched thin. Every tank, every bullet had to cross the Mediterranean, constantly hunted by British ships and aircraft. Meanwhile, the British refused to surrender Africa. Under new leadership, General Bernard Montgomery, they reorganized and prepared for a decisive stand. The turning point came at El Alamein in October 1942. For 12 days, the desert thundered with explosions. Thousands of tanks faced each other across open sands. Artillery shells whistled through the night, and the sky glowed red from the fires of battle. Rommel's Afrika Korps fought with desperate courage, but the British were better supplied, better armed, and backed by growing American support. On November 4, 1942, Rommel was forced to retreat. His once unstoppable army began a long withdrawal across Libya, chased by Allied forces closing in from both east and west. It was the beginning of the end for the Axis in Africa. Soon after, the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing American and British troops in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel found himself trapped between two advancing armies. By May 1943, the last German and Italian soldiers in Africa surrendered. The North African campaign was over. It had been a brutal, unforgiving war, fought in heat, sand, and blood. But its outcome changed everything. The Allies now had a foothold to invade southern Europe, and Hitler's dream of a Mediterranean empire was shattered. For Rommel, the Desert Fox, it was the beginning of his slow fall, from hero of the Reich to hunted traitor. But that story was still to come. The desert had fallen silent, yet the countdown to chaos continued, now shifting back to the heart of Europe. The year was 1942. And the war in the East had become a nightmare. Millions were dead, cities reduced to ashes, and the German advance seemed unstoppable. But on the banks of the Volga River, one city would change the fate of the entire war: Stalingrad. To Hitler, Stalingrad wasn't just a target, it was an obsession. A city bearing Stalin's name was a symbol he wanted destroyed at any cost. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. He gave one command that echoed through the Soviet ranks: not one step back. And so began one of the most brutal battles in human history. In the summer of 1942, German tanks and bombers descended upon Stalingrad. The city was turned into a furnace of rubble and flame. Entire districts vanished under waves of aerial bombardment. Yet amid the ruins, Soviet soldiers refused to surrender. Every building, every street, every stairwell became a battleground. The fighting was so close, soldiers could hear their enemies breathe. Snipers hunted each other through shattered windows. Factories turned into fortresses. The Red October steel plant, the tractor factory, and the grain elevator became symbols of defiance. The Volga River, once a lifeline, now ran red with blood. As winter approached, the German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, found itself trapped inside the city. Supplies ran out. The temperature dropped below 30 C. Frostbite, hunger, and disease tore through the ranks. Yet Hitler's orders were clear: no retreat. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack from north and south. Within days, they encircled the entire German Sixth Army. It was a trap from which there would be no escape. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, once confident of victory, now commanded an army of ghosts. Men starved, froze, and died in the ruins of the city they had nearly conquered. When Soviet forces closed in, Paulus begged Hitler to let him surrender. Hitler refused, promoting him to field marshal instead, a cruel gesture, as no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. But on February 2, 1943, Paulus finally laid down his arms. The once mighty Sixth Army was gone. Over 90,000 survivors marched into captivity, and few would ever return. Germany had suffered its greatest defeat. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was the breaking point of the Nazi war machine. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and ignited a wave of Soviet revenge that would not stop until Berlin fell. The city lay in ruins, but its spirit stood unbroken. From the ashes of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union rose with a single purpose: to push the invaders back, no matter the cost. The Eastern Front was now a sea of fire, and the countdown to chaos raged on. By 1943, the tide of World War II was shifting. The Axis powers, once unstoppable, were beginning to falter. In the East, the Soviet Union was driving back the Germans. In North Africa, the Allies had defeated Rommel's Desert Army. Now, the eyes of the world turned toward Europe itself. The plan was bold: to invade Nazi-occupied France and open a Western Front that would crush Hitler's empire from two sides. The operation would become one of the most daring military endeavors in history, Operation Overlord. But before the grand invasion, the Allies needed experience and a foothold. In July 1943, Allied forces struck Sicily. Under the scorching sun, British and American troops stormed the beaches. The fighting was fierce, but by August, the Axis defenses collapsed. The fall of Sicily shook Italy to its core. Mussolini was overthrown, and the new Italian government surrendered. Yet the Germans refused to give up Italy easily, turning the mountainous terrain into a deadly trap. The Allies fought inch by inch, from Salerno to Monte Cassino, paying in blood for every advance. Meanwhile, in secret bases across England, preparations for the greatest invasion in human history were underway. The code name, D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of troops were trained, thousands of tanks, ships, and planes assembled. And to deceive the Germans, the Allies built an entire fake army: inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, and dummy camps designed to mislead Hitler about where the invasion would strike. Then, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, the skies over France roared with the sound of Allied aircraft. Paratroopers leapt into darkness, scattered across enemy lines. At dawn, the horizon of Normandy erupted. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword became the gates of liberation. The Germans were ready, but not enough. At Omaha Beach, the American assault met a storm of machine gun fire. Bodies littered the sand. Waves turned crimson. Yet, through sheer courage, the men pressed on, climbing cliffs, storming bunkers, and breaking through. By nightfall, over 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France. It was the beginning of the end for Hitler's dream of domination. As tanks rolled inland and resistance forces rose up, the German army faced a nightmare it could no longer control: a war on every front, from Normandy's hedgerows to the frozen steppes of Russia. For the first time, Europe could see hope again. The Allies had returned, and from that moment on, the Nazi regime's collapse became inevitable. But victory would not come easily. The road to Berlin would still demand unimaginable sacrifice. For now, though, the tide had turned, and in the long, dark night of war, a glimmer of dawn began to rise. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was crumbling. The Allies had liberated France and were advancing toward Germany's heartland. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was closing in with unstoppable fury. Hitler's empire was surrounded, the walls of his ambition closing in on him. But even in defeat, the Führer refused to surrender. He planned one last, desperate strike, a gamble that he believed could split the Allied forces and turn the war back in Germany's favor. The operation would take place in the dense, snow-covered forests of Belgium's Ardennes. The world would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, in the freezing early hours, the silence of winter was shattered by the roar of German artillery. Thousands of shells rained down on unsuspecting American positions. Tanks rolled through the fog, and over 200,000 German soldiers surged forward in a surprise attack. At first, chaos reigned. Allied lines broke. Towns fell. German panzers punched deep into enemy territory, creating a massive bulge in the front lines, hence the name. It seemed for a moment that Hitler's gamble might succeed, but the Americans refused to break. At the town of Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division held their ground. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave one legendary reply: "Nuts." With supplies running low and temperatures plummeting below zero, the defenders clung to survival. Snow mixed with blood, and the frozen forests echoed with the thunder of tank battles. Then, from the skies, salvation arrived. Allied aircraft grounded for days by bad weather finally broke through the clouds. They bombed German convoys and dropped supplies to the trapped troops. The tide turned once more. General George S. Patton, leading his Third Army, executed one of the fastest maneuvers in military history, pivoting north through the snow to relieve Bastogne. German forces, exhausted and short on fuel, began to falter. Their mighty tanks stood silent, abandoned in the ice. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. Germany had thrown its last reserves into the fight and lost them all. Over 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Reich's final hope of victory had frozen to death in the Ardennes. As Allied troops pushed across the Rhine and Soviet armies advanced from the east, the end was now inevitable. Hitler's thousand-year Reich had less than 4 months left to live. The forests of Belgium fell silent once more, but the echo of that desperate battle would forever mark the last gasp of Nazi ambition. The world was closing in on Berlin, and the countdown to chaos was nearly complete. By early 1945, the war had entered its final, savage act. The Nazi Empire was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins. The once proud Wehrmacht was now a shadow of its former self. But in the east, a storm unlike any other was gathering, a storm called the Red Army. For 4 years, the Soviet Union had bled. 20 million of its people were dead. Entire cities erased. Now, with vengeance burning hotter than ever, the Soviets were marching west, and their eyes were fixed on one prize: Berlin. Under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, millions of Soviet soldiers prepared for the final offensive. Across the frozen plains of Poland, their tanks rolled relentlessly forward. German resistance was fierce but futile. Village after village fell beneath the weight of the Soviet advance. By January 1945, the Red Army had crossed the Vistula River and smashed through German lines at lightning speed. The once invincible Wehrmacht now retreated in chaos. Refugees flooded the roads, women, children, and the elderly all fleeing west from the advancing Soviet tide. But for the Red Army, this was more than a battle. It was retribution. The memories of Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Kursk fueled their rage. Every step toward Berlin was a step toward justice or vengeance. In April 1945, the Soviet offensive reached the Oder River, less than 60 kilometers from Berlin. The final gateway stood before them. The Germans knew this was the end. Old men and teenage boys, members of the Volkssturm, were handed rifles and ordered to defend the capital. They had no chance. Then, on April 16th, the ground shook with the thunder of over 20,000 Soviet guns. The largest artillery bombardment in human history had begun. The sky turned red with fire. Berlin's defenses collapsed under the relentless assault. The Battle of Berlin, the last great battle of World War II, had begun. Soviet troops advanced through hellish terrain, fields of mud, smoke, and flame. The Germans fought desperately, turning every street, every ruin, into a fortress. But nothing could stop the tide. By April 25th, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin entirely, linking up with the Americans at the Elbe River. The Nazi capital was now isolated, trapped under a ring of steel. Inside the Führer's bunker, Hitler still ranted about imaginary counterattacks. But outside, the Third Reich was dying. Artillery thundered day and night. The once mighty city of Berlin was now a graveyard of stone and steel. The Red Army was closing in for the kill. For every Soviet soldier, this was more than victory. It was the final act of revenge for a nation that had suffered beyond imagination. The end was near. Berlin would soon fall, and with it, the madness that had set the world on fire. April 1945. The world's most powerful dictator was trapped beneath the crumbling streets of his own capital. Above him, the city of Berlin burned. Soviet artillery shells screamed through the air, reducing entire districts to dust. The Third Reich, once promised to last 1,000 years, was dying after just 12. In the depths of the Führer's bunker, Adolf Hitler clung to delusion. Maps of imaginary armies covered the walls. He issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. Every hour, his circle of followers grew smaller, his paranoia greater. Outside, the sound of gunfire drew closer. The Soviet assault had reached the heart of Berlin. Street by street, block by block, Red Army soldiers fought their way toward the Reich Chancellery. German resistance was desperate. Teenagers of the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm fought to the last bullet. But it was hopeless. The Soviet flag was already rising above the city's ruins. Inside the bunker, time seemed frozen. Hitler raged against his generals, blaming them for betrayal. He refused to flee, refusing to believe the end was real. Even as the walls shook, he spoke of miracle weapons and turning tides. But there were no miracles left. On April 28th, news reached him that Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body hung upside down in the streets of Milan. Hitler understood what awaited him. He made his decision. 2 days later, on April 30th, 1945, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony. The next afternoon, he said farewell to his staff, thanked them for their loyalty, and withdrew to his private room with Eva. Moments later, single gunshot echoed through the corridors. Adolf Hitler was dead. The man who had plunged the world into war, who had brought death to millions, ended his life in a bunker beneath the ruins of his dream. His body was burned, as he had ordered, by his remaining guards. Above ground, the Red Army surged forward. On May 2, 1945, Berlin officially fell. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, a symbol that the nightmare was finally ending. In the West, Allied forces continued to sweep across Germany, liberating concentration camps and capturing the remnants of the Nazi war machine. The war in Europe was over. The dictator was gone. But the cost was unimaginable. Over 50 million lives lost. Cities destroyed. Nations scarred forever. In the smoldering ruins of Berlin, silence finally returned. A silence heavy with memory, grief, and guilt. The world had witnessed the rise and fall of madness, and as the smoke cleared, humanity faced a haunting question. How could it ever allow such chaos to rise again? May 1945. Europe was silent. After 6 long years of destruction, the guns had finally fallen quiet. The flags of the Allies now flew over the ruins of what had once been Hitler's empire. The Third Reich, built on lies, hatred, and blood, was gone. Berlin lay in ashes. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The once mighty German army was shattered, its soldiers surrendering in droves. Across Europe, the swastika was torn down, replaced by the banners of victory and of mourning. On May 7, 1945, at a schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. For the Allies, it was victory at last. For the German people, it was devastation. The next day, May 8, became known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. In London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, crowds flooded the streets in celebration. Church bells rang, confetti filled the air, and strangers embraced, as tears of relief poured down their faces. After years of fear and suffering, peace had finally returned to Europe. But peace came at a terrible cost. Entire nations lay in ruins. Over 60 million people were dead: soldiers, civilians, and the innocent victims of genocide. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to ghostly wastelands. As Allied troops advanced deeper into Germany, they uncovered the darkest secret of the Nazi regime: the concentration camps. At places like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau, soldiers found mountains of corpses, starving survivors, and evidence of systematic murder. The world was forced to confront the full horror of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, had been exterminated in one of history's greatest crimes. In the months that followed, the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, took control of Germany. The nation was divided into zones of occupation. Its leaders, those still alive, were captured and brought to justice. The Nuremberg trials would soon expose the monstrous crimes committed under Hitler's rule. But even in defeat, the scars of war ran deep. Millions were homeless, families torn apart, cities had to be rebuilt from dust, and entire generations carried the trauma of what they had witnessed. The victory that ended tyranny also marked the beginning of a new world, one divided by ideology and fear. The Allies had won the war, but a new conflict, the Cold War, was already taking shape. For now, though, in the ashes of Berlin and the ruins of Europe, humanity could breathe again. The nightmare was over. The price of victory had been unimaginable, but the world had survived the storm. The countdown to chaos had reached its end in Europe. But across the seas, another fire was still burning: the Pacific. While Europe celebrated victory, another war still raged across oceans, a war as brutal as any fought on land. The Pacific theater had become a storm of fire and steel. For years, the Allies, led by the United States, had been battling the Empire of Japan in one of the most savage campaigns in history. Since Pearl Harbor, Japan had expanded across the Pacific, capturing vast territories from the Philippines to Burma, Singapore, and countless islands. But by 1944, the tide was turning. American industry and manpower were now fully unleashed, and the Allies were on the offensive. The strategy was simple but deadly: island hopping. One island at a time, Allied forces fought their way toward Japan itself, bypassing strongholds and cutting off enemy supply lines. Each step brought them closer to Tokyo, and each battle was a nightmare. At Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, American soldiers faced fanatical resistance. Japanese troops fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. When cornered, many civilians, driven by propaganda, chose death over capture, leaping from cliffs into the sea. It was war without mercy. Then came Iwo Jima, a small island, only 8 square miles, but vital for its airfields. In February 1945, 70,000 U.S. Marines stormed its black volcanic sands. The defenders, 20,000 Japanese soldiers, were dug deep into tunnels and bunkers. The fighting raged for over a month. When it was over, nearly every Japanese soldier was dead. The cost was staggering: almost 7,000 Americans killed. But the image of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an eternal symbol of courage and sacrifice. Yet even Iwo Jima was only a prelude to something worse: Okinawa. In April 1945, the largest battle of the Pacific began. Hundreds of thousands of troops clashed in a typhoon of fire. Japanese soldiers, civilians, and kamikaze pilots all fought to the end. Entire ships were destroyed by suicide attacks. By the time the battle ended in June, over 200,000 people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Okinawa was the gateway to Japan, and it showed what an invasion of the Japanese mainland might cost. The world had never seen such destruction, and the U.S. knew that to end this war, something decisive had to be done. Behind closed doors, a new and terrifying weapon was being prepared, a weapon that would change history forever. It was called the Manhattan Project, and its purpose was simple: to end the war with one strike of unimaginable power. The Pacific burned, the skies filled with ash, and the world stood on the edge of the final act. The Allies were ready to bring the war to Japan's doorstep, and the countdown to chaos was about to reach its most terrifying moment. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its breaking point. Japan stood alone, its navy destroyed, its cities burning, and its people starving. Yet the empire refused to surrender. To the Japanese military, death was preferable to defeat. To the Allies, an invasion of Japan seemed inevitable and catastrophic. American planners estimated that such an invasion, codename Operation Downfall, could cost millions of lives on both sides. But in secret laboratories across America, a new weapon had been created, one unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was called the atomic bomb. Born from the Manhattan Project, this weapon drew its power from the atom itself, capable of releasing energy equal to thousands of tons of TNT in a single flash. The scientists who built it feared what they had unleashed, but the decision was not theirs to make. President Harry S. Truman, faced with the choice between invasion and annihilation, chose to end the war swiftly, whatever the cost. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew high above the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, fell silently through the clouds. Seconds later, the world changed forever. A blinding flash lit the sky. A fireball hotter than the sun consumed the city. Buildings, people, and everything within a mile of the blast vanished instantly. The shockwave flattened everything for miles. Within minutes, 80,000 people were dead. The city became a silent wasteland of fire and shadow. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another city was turned to ash. Tens of thousands more perished in an instant. Those who survived faced a horror beyond imagination: burns, radiation, sickness, and a landscape where even shadows were seared into stone. For the first time in history, humanity had witnessed its own power to destroy itself completely. Japan was devastated. Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of tradition, addressed his people directly on August 15, 1945. His voice, calm but sorrowful, carried across the airwaves: "We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable." Japan had surrendered. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over. But as the fires burned out, a new fear took hold. The atomic age had begun. The same weapon that ended the war also opened a terrifying new chapter for mankind, one where a single bomb could end civilization itself. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just the end of a war. They were the warning of what war could become. The world had witnessed the ultimate chaos, born not from hatred alone, but from human invention. The countdown to chaos had ended, but a new clock, the atomic clock, had just begun to tick. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked upon itself and did not recognize what it had become. Cities lay in ashes, empires had collapsed, and millions wandered homeless, searching for families that no longer existed. The war had ended, but the suffering had only begun. Across Europe, once proud capitals like Berlin, Warsaw, and London stood shattered. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to skeletons of brick and stone. The continent that had once ruled the world now lay in ruin. Over 60 million lives had been lost: men, women, and children, soldiers and civilians alike. For every bomb that had fallen, there was a story that would never be told again. The survivors moved like ghosts through the rubble. In Germany, hunger and despair swept the land. In Poland and the Soviet Union, entire towns had vanished. The Holocaust had exposed the darkest depths of human cruelty. 6 million Jews murdered in cold precision. When Allied troops uncovered the concentration camps, the world was forced to look directly into the face of evil. In Asia, the devastation was no less horrifying. Japan's cities were burned beyond recognition, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, now silent memorials to humanity's destructive power. In China, millions had perished from invasion and famine. Across the Pacific, war had left scars that would last for generations. But amid the ashes, the world tried to rebuild. Nations came together, not for conquest, but for recovery. From the ruins of Europe rose a new vision, the United Nations. Founded in 1945, with a promise to prevent such horror from ever returning. The hope was simple and desperate: never again. In the United States, a new role emerged: the world's new superpower, armed not only with military might, but with atomic fire. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union rose from its own ashes, determined to rebuild under the shadow of Stalin. Though the war was over, a new tension was forming, one not fought with guns, but with fear. The Cold War had begun to whisper its first threats. For ordinary people, survival became the new battle. Food lines stretched for miles. Families dug through rubble to find photographs, toys, or a familiar face. In every corner of the earth, a single question echoed: was it worth it? Artists painted grief. Writers turned trauma into memory, and soldiers who returned home found themselves strangers in a peaceful world that no longer felt like home. World War II had changed everything: politics, technology, morality, even humanity itself. It had proven the best and worst of mankind: courage and cruelty, sacrifice and slaughter, invention and annihilation. The world in 1945 stood at a crossroads, broken but alive. And as the dust settled over the ruins, one truth became clear: though the war had ended, the consequences had only just begun. The guns of World War II had gone silent, but the world was far from peaceful. The old alliances that had defeated Hitler now began to crumble, replaced by suspicion, fear, and rivalry. Out of the ashes of the global war, a new conflict was born: a war of ideology, influence, and intimidation. It was called the Cold War. In 1945, the Allied leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had stood side by side against fascism. But victory had only masked their differences. The West fought for democracy and free markets. The East dreamed of communism and control. The war had united them against a common enemy. But now, that enemy was gone, and they were left staring at each other. Europe became the first battleground, not with tanks and bombs, but with borders and beliefs. As the Soviet army moved west, it occupied much of Eastern Europe: Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. Stalin claimed he was securing peace, but the people living under his rule saw something else: the birth of a new empire. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a warning to the world: from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. That iron curtain became the symbol of a divided planet: East versus West, communism versus capitalism. The United States, determined to stop Soviet expansion, began a new policy called containment. Money, aid, and influence became the new weapons. Through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars flowed into Western Europe, rebuilding cities, factories, and hope. In the East, the Soviet Union answered with strict control and propaganda, turning its satellite nations into loyal states under Moscow's shadow. The world now stood on two sides, and every nation had to choose. The Cold War was not fought in the trenches, but in boardrooms, laboratories, and spy networks. Nuclear bombs replaced rifles, fear replaced front lines, and humanity learned to live with the constant threat of annihilation. Berlin became the heart of this new confrontation. In 1948, Stalin blockaded the city, cutting off all food and supplies to its western zones. But in an extraordinary act of defiance, American and British pilots began the Berlin airlift, flying in tons of supplies every day. For 11 months, the planes never stopped, proof that the West would not yield. The blockade failed, but the division of Germany was now permanent: East and West Berlin, divided by ideology, and soon, by a wall of concrete and fear. Across the world, propaganda painted each side as the enemy. Children learned to hide under desks, Politicians spoke of freedom and destruction in the same breath. The peace that followed World War II was no peace at all. It was a fragile ceasefire built on mistrust. The war to end all wars had birthed a new kind of war, one without end. The Cold War had begun, and the countdown to chaos had simply changed its face. As the world rebuilt from the ruins of World War II, two nations stood taller than the rest: the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had emerged victorious, but their visions for the future were entirely different. The old European empires were gone, and in their place rose a new kind of global order, a world dominated by two superpowers locked in a struggle for control of the planet. The United States became the face of democracy, capitalism, and freedom, a nation of immense industrial power and global influence. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, represented the ideology of communism, a world where the state reigned supreme, and equality was enforced at any cost. Each side believed its system was the path to salvation. Each feared the other was plotting its destruction. The battle for the world's future was not fought openly, but through politics, propaganda, and power. The United States formed new alliances. NATO in 1949, a military pact designed to protect Western nations from Soviet aggression. In response, Stalin created the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern Europe under Moscow's control. Every country now stood in one camp or the other, and neutrality became a dangerous dream. The race for influence spread far beyond Europe. In Asia, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong in 1949, sending shockwaves across the West. In the same year, the Soviet Union shocked the world by detonating its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear power. For the first time in history, two nations now possessed the ability to destroy civilization itself. Fear gripped the world. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills. Soviet citizens lived under constant state surveillance and fear of arrest. Movies, radio, and newspapers in both nations painted the other as the enemy, a shadow always waiting to strike. The 1950s became an age of paranoia and pride. The space race began a contest not only of science, but of superiority. Each side aimed to prove its dominance in the heavens, launching rockets, satellites, and men into space. But beneath the triumphs of technology lurked the same cold truth. Every advancement in science brought the world closer to total destruction. Leaders like Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and Nikita Khrushchev shaped this tense era, testing, taunting, and negotiating through threats and power plays. The arms race escalated, creating weapons capable of ending humanity in seconds. The phrase, mutually assured destruction, became a grim doctrine, peace through the promise of apocalypse. Across the globe, nations aligned, revolutions erupted, and spies infiltrated governments. The entire planet became a chessboard, with the US and user moving pieces that could start or stop. Armageddon. World War II had ended the age of empires, but it had birthed the age of superpowers. And as America and the Soviet Union faced each other across oceans and ideologies, by 1962, the Cold War had reached its most dangerous moment. For nearly 2 decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had tested, threatened, and outmaneuvered one another. But now, the world was about to stare straight into the face of nuclear war. This was the moment when the countdown to chaos nearly reached zero. It began on a small island just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, Cuba. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. His rise to power and his alliance with the Soviet Union terrified Washington. When the US tried to remove him through the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Castro turned completely toward Moscow for protection. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity, a way to shift the balance of power. If America could station nuclear missiles in Turkey, near Soviet borders, then why not place Soviet missiles in Cuba, aimed right at the United States? It would be a move of perfect symmetry and deadly risk. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered long-range nuclear missile sites being built on Cuban soil. The images were undeniable. In an instant, the illusion of safety vanished. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors faced a nightmare scenario: nuclear war in Europe. But at America's doorstep, for 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of annihilation. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, demanding that all Soviet ships turn back. Warships circled the Caribbean. Nuclear bombers sat armed on runways. Every radio broadcast, every news headline carried the same silent fear: that this could be the end. Inside the White House and the Kremlin, messages passed back and forth in secrecy and urgency. Kennedy warned that any missile launched from Cuba would trigger a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, in turn, warned of consequences too terrible to imagine. Then, something remarkable happened. Amid all the threats and bravado, both men paused and chose restraint. Through careful negotiation, a deal was struck. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States would quietly withdraw its own from Turkey and promise never to invade the island again. On October 28, 1962, the crisis ended. The missiles were dismantled, and the ships turned around. The world exhaled slowly, cautiously, disbelieving it had survived. For 13 days, humanity had looked over the edge of its own destruction and stepped back. The Cuban Missile Crisis became the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. It showed that even in the depths of fear, diplomacy could still save lives. But the lesson was also clear: as long as such weapons existed, the threat would never truly disappear. The countdown to chaos had paused, but it was still ticking, quietly, beneath the surface of peace. For nearly half a century, the Cold War had divided the planet, a frozen conflict of power, pride, and paranoia. But by the 1980s, the world was beginning to change. The great empires that had once ruled through fear and ideology were starting to crumble, not from invasion, but from within. In the Soviet Union, decades of military spending and political control had drained the nation's strength. The people wanted freedom, not fear. They wanted bread, not bombs. Under the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, a new word began to echo through the streets of Moscow: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning reform. Gorbachev believed the Soviet Union could survive by modernizing, but in trying to save it, he had unknowingly set in motion its collapse. Across Eastern Europe, the people rose. In Poland, Lech Wales's Solidarity movement demanded democracy and workers' rights. In Hungary, the border to Austria quietly opened, allowing East Germans to escape to the West. The Iron Curtain, once thought indestructible, was beginning to tear. And then, in 1989, the unthinkable happened. In Berlin, crowds of Germans gathered at the wall that had divided their city for nearly 30 years. They came with hammers, chisels, and bare hands, not to destroy in anger, but to reclaim their unity. The Berlin Wall fell, not with an explosion, but with celebration. Tears and laughter filled the air as families long separated embraced in the ruins of concrete. The symbol of division was gone, and with it, the Cold War's greatest wall. Within 2 years, the Soviet Empire followed. On December 25, 1991, the USSR, once the greatest rival of the United States, ceased to exist. Its red flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The world watched as 70 years of communism dissolved into history. The United States stood alone as the world's remaining superpower. Nuclear war had been avoided. Democracy had triumphed in much of the world. But the victory came with new uncertainty, new nations, new borders, and new struggles waiting to begin. For the first time in modern history, the world had survived an era that could have ended it. The Cold War had not ended in fire, but in exhaustion, not through conquest, but through the simple desire of ordinary people to live free. From the rubble of Berlin to the heart of Moscow, the echo was the same. No more walls, no more fear. The fall of empires marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new world, one built on fragile hope. and haunted by the memory of what had almost been lost. The countdown to chaos was finally slowing, but humanity's story of power, ambition, and survival was far from over. The guns have long fallen silent, the cities have been rebuilt, and the generation that fought the deadliest war in human history has slowly faded into memory, but their story, our story, remains carved into the soul of the modern world. The legacy of World War II is more than history. It is a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the brutality of mankind. From the ashes of chaos rose new beginnings. The United Nations was born, a fragile hope to prevent such destruction from ever returning. Nations once at war became partners in peace. Germany and Japan, once symbols of aggression, transformed into democracies, rebuilding not only their cities, but their spirits. The dream was that the world had finally learned that humanity could never again walk the same dark path. Yet, even as the bombs stopped falling, the echoes of war continued to shape the future. Borders were redrawn, empires vanished. Technology, once created for death, fueled the next wave of progress, from nuclear energy to space exploration. The Cold War, the atomic age, and the race to the stars were all born from the same inferno that began in 1939. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all came not from the victors, but from the victims. From the ashes of Auschwitz, the world said, "Never again." From the ruins of Hiroshima came the warning that science without conscience could destroy us all. From the graves of millions came the understanding that freedom and peace are not gifts, they are responsibilities. Today, when we look at the world, at new conflicts, new rivalries, new divisions, we can still hear the faint ticking of that old clock, the countdown to chaos. Because war is not a ghost of the past, it is a shadow that follows us into the future. And whether that shadow grows or fades depends on the choices we make now. Every soldier who fell, every child who suffered, every city that burned, they left behind a message written not in words, but in blood and silence. Remember how easily hate can be disguised as patriotism. Remember how propaganda can turn neighbors into enemies. Remember how power can blind men to their own humanity. And most of all, remember that peace, true peace, is not built by treaties or weapons, but by understanding. The story of World War II is not just a story of the past. It is the story of who we are and who we must never become again. As the generations pass and the last witnesses fade, it falls upon us to keep the memory alive. Because history forgotten is history repeated. This was the war that changed the world. And though the countdown to chaos may never truly end, the memory of those who lived and died through it will forever remind us that even in our darkest hour, humanity still has the power to rise again.